Myel stepped out onto the sand, its grains bathed in moonlight. It was actually quite a beautiful scene, all things considered. Dressed only in a tunic and breeches, Myel's bare feet sank slightly in the sand as he raised his gaze, taking in the countless twinkling stars which hung so purely against the blackness of the night. The crescent moon seemed particularly big, and Myel secretly wished he could watch it forever. But time was of the essence, and he could see that Balden was already sat upon the sand, a few dozen feet away. Myel took a deep breath, gulping nervously, a cold bead of sweat running down his brow and onto his cheek. Myel took a step closer, then another, each time feeling his body getting heavier, his legs beginning to tremble. For a moment he stopped, wiping the sweat from his brow and sweeping his long platinum hair out of his face and behind his head. He was only a few feet away, but his body was reluctant to move any closer.
"Oh, stop being such a drama queen and come sit down, Myel,"
Balden said with a slight chuckle. His voice was coarse, and despite his jovial tone, he was quiet, his body rigid. Myel stared at Balden, taking in every detail on his face, his shaggy brown hair and full beard, the scar that split his moustache on his upper lip, and the bear print tattoo that adorned the left side of his neck. Myel forced his limbs to move, with him finally standing over the seated Balden, who held his arms around his bent knees.
"My friend, there is so much to say, yet not enough time to say it in. Surely, there must be some way to..."
Myel's desperate plea was instantly cut off as Balden began to speak.
"Do you remember the day we met, down in the meadows of Goldview by the Shuan River? What were we, 5 or 6? I can't even remember now. Funny how some things just slip from your memory, eh? It might as well have been a dream with how little else I remember at that time."
Another chuckle fell from Balden's lips as he tried to recall his childhood.
"I remember watching you and the other children taking turns to jump into the river. Erin didn't want to get her new dress wet, but one of you pushed her in. I also remember that none of you wanted to take the blame, so you all ended up with a scolding."
Myel replied, allowing himself a wry smile and a brief chuckle.
"Indeed, you were lucky we hadn't become friends yet. Could you imagine what your father would have done if you'd been involved?"
Balden chortled, finally looking up to Myel and taking in his iridescent blue-grey skin, silver eyes and platinum hair.
"To dishonor a young lady in such a fashion, I dread to think even at that age. Fret not, though. You managed to get me into plenty of trouble that I got a good lashing for through the years."
Myel answered with an almost upbeat amusement.
"Nonsense, Myel. Just because I come up with a tremendously daring plan doesn't mean you have to come with me."
As Balden spoke, Myel opened his mouth, but a hand shot up, cutting him off.
"And before you say it was because I forced you, remember that you were the child of a soldier. You'd already been taught to fight, had armor and a sword. I could never force you to do anything."
Both turned to each other, an intense stare between them, before both began to laugh, more openly than before, with Myel finally sitting beside Balden and nudging him slightly.
"And yet I always sought out your approval, even more than my father's. You were fun, adventurous, fearless. Nothing fazed you. Father was always such a stick in the mud, obsessed with image and position. I didn't understand him, even after his death. It wasn't until I stood where he stood, when I finally appreciated his lessons."
Myel's face dropped, a look of self-loathing in his eyes.
Oh, don't be so hard on yourself. We were still kids when we lost your father. The lessons he taught take time to sink in, and even longer to accept. If there truly is an afterlife, I'm sure he walks the verdant plains of Aegalas, and when it is your time, I'm sure you will be reunited with him, and you will drink, feast, and share your stories and triumphs, Balden stated confidently.
I hope you're right, my friend. Though I wonder if he could ever forgive me after my mistake.
Myel instantly silenced himself. A look of pain and an unrelenting shame etched itself into his features as he curled himself up, resting his head on his knees. Balden opened his mouth, but stopped himself, taking a moment to truly think about what he was about to say.
Don't you dare start blaming yourself for that again, Myel.
Balden growled forcefully.
It was I, and I alone, who shoulders that blame. As always, selfishly looking for glory, thinking I could prove myself a warrior.
Balden looked away, flustered and angry with himself. Myel looked up from his curled position, his face softening.
But it was I who failed my part of the plan. You would have taken it down easily, had I not messed up.
Myel looked to his right arm, where 4 huge gashes had scarred, before clutching them with his other hand.
My father must have known we were up to something, to have found us up in the mountains in time. I never questioned it until now. He must have followed us from the start.
Myel's mouth rested into an involuntary smile as his mind raced with all sorts of questions that he'd never asked himself before.
Your father fought bravely, though, and ferociously. Though I say it with great shame, he died a hero's death, with honor, protecting his son, as well as the little prat who dragged him up there.
Balden stated, unsure even now if he was worthy of saying such words. He still could not bring himself to look at Myel, but out of the corner of his eye, he saw his friend's smile widen.
But you fought bravely too. I still have never seen a bear that big, not in 20 years. After it felled my father, I cowered before it, seeing death in its eyes and blood in its maw. I knew me and Kynan were next, and Heron behind us. Then you ran in, with a roar that would make a Leonian blush. You thrust your spear through its flank, and as it dropped to all fours, you slid under its head, sticking your first dagger into its throat, and then your second into the other side. It flailed madly, but you held on, sinking your blade deeper, its blood gushing out onto you. You looked like a Westmore barbarian by the end. You brought down Balden. You saved us. How could I ever blame you?
Because you received all of the blame, the scorn, the resentment,
Balden retorted angrily.
All the while, I got the praise for slaying the beast. First blood at 13, the youngest in the history of Galabus to bring down a mountain bear on their own. So what? I couldn't enjoy that victory. Not when we lost your father in the process, and certainly not while you endured your mother's wrath, when it should have been me in your place.
As years of pent-up bile spewed from Balden's mouth, he frustratedly pointed to the bear print tattoo on his neck.
They gave me this as an accolade. Balden the Beast Slayer, they called me. What a joke. The only reason I never burnt the ink from my flesh was to keep the memory of your father with me, to always remember his bravery, and to remind me to be better every single day.
Tears began to well in Balden's eyes, and a look of sorrowful surprise washed across Myel's face.
I never realized you'd kept all this with you through the years. I want you to know, truly, from the bottom of my heart, I have never blamed you, nor resented you. Your victory was your own, and I have always respected you for it. You are a great warrior, and in our entire careers, You have been, and always will be, the one I look to for inspiration and strength.
As Myel finished, Balden gave out a chuckle, though Myel could tell it was forced.
I could never beat you though, could I?
Balden's words opened a hole in Myel's soul, and his heart dropped.
Whether it be a sparring match or a friendly competition, you have always bested me. And I have no doubt that you will do so again.
Though Balden smiled in his words, Myel could see the pain and fear in his friend's eyes.
Let us not talk of such things. The future is not set in stone, and the night is too beautiful to keep speaking of blood and battle.
A contemplative look fell on Myel's face as he racked his brain for another topic, whilst Balden shook his head at his friend's naivety.
Let us instead talk of what we're going to do when we get home. I told Lycia that I'd finally take her to Selenor. We'd get married in the Temple of Helena and spend our honeymoon on the Benidorm Isles.
Myel, we can't keep putting this off.
Obviously, you would be my best man, and you could even bring that lovely lady you were talking about before we left.
Myel continued, ignoring Balden's words.
Myel.
And you can finally join us in Light's Reach. There's a lovely place down the street from us that would suit you perfectly.
Myel!
Balden barked, stunning Myel into silence. One hand on his forehead, Balden sighed before continuing.
There is no lovely lady, all right? No house in Light's Reach. Not for me. You have Lycia, and you will get married. But I will not be there. You will go back to your home, and you will start a family. But I will not be there. You will watch your children grow, and you will pass on the lessons that your father taught us, but I will not be there. Only one of us will return home, and it must be you. Because you have everything to live for. Because you are the most worthy of it.
Balden, I don't understand. Why did you tell me of a lady who doesn't exist?
Myel asked, still avoiding the issue, before climbing to his feet and placing a hand on Balden's shoulder. For a moment, Balden was silent, but gave a weary sigh.
Because I didn't want you to keep thinking I was lonely. You and Lycia often comment on my lack of company. And I know you mean well, but it weighs heavily on the heart after a while. In truth, Myel, I found my love many years ago.
Balden revealed, his head lowering, his shoulders slumping forward.
What happened?
Myel asked, trying to turn Balden to face him, his friend reluctantly conceding.
I was at odds with my feelings, and slow with my advance. By the time I plucked up the courage to tell them, they had already fallen for another, and I've watched from the outside ever since.
As Balden spoke, a look of understanding washed over Myel's face, and tears ran from his sorrowful silver eyes.
Surely, there's something that can be done. Surely there must be a way out of this.
Myel pleaded as he began to sob. Balden smiled before embracing his friend in a hug, squeezing tight.
I'm afraid it's too late for that. Be strong, return home, and live for the pair of us,
Balden whispered, noticing an armored figure at the gate he'd come out of, who was beckoning him inside.
It's time, Myel,
he continued, pulling back and wiping away his own tears.
Thank you for everything. Tell Lycia I said goodbye, and sorry I couldn't get you home sooner. I love you, my friend.
And with those final words, Balden walked away, not allowing himself to look back. But Myel watched him go, a final sense of pride in his step, until he disappeared into the darkness. Myel was left alone upon the sand. He chanced one last look across the night sky, watching the stars shining hopefully, a hope which he had now been denied. He turned back the way he had come and made his way to another gate, but his step was devoid of pride. Myel looked up to the walls that surrounded him, and beyond to the seats that would hold thousands of spectators come the next day. Which one would they cheer for? Did it really matter? How many of them understood the circumstances of their appearance? How many of his regiment still lived? And would their captors honor the terms of their deal? Sleep was not kind to Myel, for his dreams were filled with the nightmarish memories of recent days. The orders to ride to Escherine, the ambush, the slaughter. How many fell to the attackers? Even in his dreams, Myel could not count them. But Balden fought ferociously, like he was the bear from all those years ago. With his axe in hand, he slaughtered dozens, trying to save their soldiers, and Myel cut down just as many, even finding the heart of an enemy captain with his sword. But the fight was ultimately a lost cause. Outmatched and outnumbered, Myel, Balden, and their troops were captured. But the martial prowess of the two captains had become quite the talking point in the enemy ranks, and thus a bargain was struck. The next day, his head still swimming from the nightmares, Myel stood at the same gate, head to toe in his glimmering silver steel armor. His breastplate boasted the proud sigil of Light's Reach, a silver hand grasping a golden sun. He held his shield in his right hand, white with gold trim and patterning. In his left hand, he held his sword, gleaming as the day it was presented to him. The gate opened, and the crowd cheered as Myel of Light's Reach stepped out onto the sand, his footsteps still present from the night before. Across the arena, Balden stepped forth, his bearded axe in one hand and round shield in the other. He wore his bearskin cloak, hide boots and gloves, and scaled armor. He was calm, his arms to his sides, as he stared across the way to his friend. A smile curled onto Balden's face, and the man began to beat his axe across his shield. Myel lowered himself into a fighting stance, taking a long, deep breath.